Good evening and welcome. I am Cheptoko Zitan Bakna, the Deputy Director of the Library. We're very pleased to have all of you here today and very honored to host Zakes Mda, my fellow African. I was born in Kenya and I'm proud to see the great literature that Africa continues to produce, following in the footsteps of such great literary figures such as Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka. Honorary Consul of South Africa, Lee Schultz, will introduce our author this evening. Lee developed a respect and affection for South Africa and the South African people from his business travel to South Africa and also from an extended family holiday. Lee has more than 40 years of legal experience in maritime law, commodities law, and import and export regulatory issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Lee Schultz.
Thank you for that kind introduction. As Honorary Consul for Kansas and Missouri, I am more than pleased to note the cultural connections between South Africa and Kansas City. For example, the play Wusa Albert, performed at the William Jewell College. The Cape Town Symphony was at the Folly Theater year before last. Ladysmith Black Mambazo was at our new Kaufman Center, January 24, and Soweto Gospel Choir will be at the Johnson County Community College on March 24. Put that on your calendar. With these cultural connections, I should also note the wonderful connections that we have from people in the South African community. And I'll note librarians, since that's where we are. Carol Levers, director of the Kansas City, Kansas Library System. Lorraine Harakorn, director of the KU Library System. This evening, our cultural connection with South Africa takes a new dimension, the literary dimension, with our guest, Mr. Zakes Mda, an acclaimed South African author and playwright, speaking on his new autobiography, Memoirs of an Outsider. Sometimes there's a void. I've read large pieces of it. I can't claim to have read every page yet, but I will. It provides a very firsthand, intimate view of the anti-apartheid struggle. It provides an intimate account of his personal experiences, relationships, and his growth, and a few other things. And with interesting insight to South African culture and changes in that culture. I also note, I should note his incredible ability to remember the names of every person that he dealt with even 40 years ago. I can't do that. Well, as an example of the acclaim that he holds, a copy of the invitation went to a young lady in St. Louis who I knew quite well, and she emailed back to me expressing her regret that she could not be here, and expressing her great admiration for Zakes. But the telling part of it was the reference, the subject of her email was hyperventilating that she couldn't be here. I'm not a literary reviewer or commentator, and I must leave that to people who are more qualified. I do have two personal connections that I must note. First, as a member of the legal profession, I note for over 40 years, I do note that Zakes was surrounded all of his life by members of the legal profession, his father, his brothers, and many of the other people that he encountered. And I really hope that I can tease some comment out of him on the role of the legal profession in the world and how they may have contributed to change for the good in a lot of ways. Secondly, Zakes has a practice of picking up hitchhikers. Well, I too have picked up hitchhikers in South Africa, Swaziland, Zimbabwe. And despite what others might think of the practice, I've found it leads to some interesting experiences and some interesting communication. With that, let me give you Zakes Mda.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Kansas City Public Library for inviting me here. Well, the book that I want to talk about and actually read from, as you heard already, is titled Sometimes There Is a Void, Memoirs of an Outsider. I'm happy that, in fact, you identified the book as an autobiography rather than a memoir. Although, well, the title, the publishers and all that, they call it memoirs in plural of an outsider. Maybe they see it more as a series of memoirs. I see it more as an autobiography rather than a memoir. And the distinction that I make here is that, well, an autobiography is really, the life story. The life, and in my case, the life and times of the author. The times part of it is very important because although this book is really about my life and my, what shaped me, both as a human being and as an artist, it is also about the times that shaped me and the people who I interacted with, during that shaping, when the shaping was happening. A memoir, on the other hand, zooms into an aspect of the writer's life. It is not the lives and times, from birth to some point, or death or whatever. But it zooms into an aspect of the writer's life and is much more reflective. It deals with a specific theme and is reflective on that theme. Analytic, it can even be philosophical or engage in polemics and so on that particular theme. That's what a true memoir does. Mine does not quite do that. Well, it is reflective as well. It does that from time to time. So there are moments when it blurs that line of demarcation between autobiography and memoir. Maybe that's why then the publisher, these are memoirs really, because as one reviewer said, here you could actually have a number of memoirs, if you were to tease out the themes, of the book. You can have 3, 4, or 5 separate memoirs in that case. Well, I was born in South Africa in 1948. My father was a teacher then. He later became a lawyer. He went back to school and studied law. But he was also a politician. He was one of the founder members of the ANC Youth League in the late 1940s and was in fact the president of the ANC Youth League after the first president died, Anton Lembede. He took over as the president of the ANC Youth League. He then left Johannesburg and went to the Eastern Cape to study law and practiced in the Eastern Cape, where he was arrested. At some stage, he managed to escape from prison and crossed the river to a neighboring country called Lesotho, which was then a British colony. I later followed him into exile and became a refugee with him in Lesotho. So this book traces that journey, my journey from the Eastern Cape to Johannesburg, where I grew up because my mother was working there, to exile in Lesotho. And in all these instances, of course, I'm also looking at some of the political events, that directly affected me, either because I was directly involved with those events and with those various people, or my family was somehow affected by them. So it is truly the life and times. A reader will get many, there are many things, different things that you can get if your interest, is on the politics and the history of South Africa and Lesotho and so on. There's a lot of that here. Lots of stuff also that has never been published elsewhere, about some people, some well-known people who became actors in the unfolding story of South Africa. So what I'm going to do tonight then is to read, just for you to get the taste of what this book is my approach, generally. So I'm going to read 3 segments from various sections of the book. And then after that, I'm hoping that we'll have some dialogue. You might have questions and comments and so on. The first segment that I'm going to read here, a couple of pages, is when I was a little boy, perhaps age 5 or 6 or something like that. And then we'll move on from there. Now, I must mention that the way I tell this story, this is not a linear narrative, you see. I use what is known as anachrony, where I shuttle between the past and the present. The past and the present. Some event in the past some event in the present reminds me of the past, and then I narrate that past, and I come back to the present, and so on. What strikes me as I drive past the Catholic mission is that it still looks the same. In 55 years, nothing has been added, nothing has been taken away. All the stone buildings with red roofs are exactly as I remember them. Even the house where we lived when I was born. My father must have celebrated his new job at St. Teresa Native Secondary School with my conception. For I was born on the 6th of October, 1948, 9 months after he joined the staff. I wasn't born in that house though, but at Mlamli Hospital, a few kilometers from the mission station. My father named me Zanemvula, which has the double meaning of the rain bringer and the one who has been brought by rain. I do not think the heavens opened up and wept when I was born. Rather, I was named after a character in Ingumbo Yeminyanya, the isiXhosa novel by A.C. Jordan that was published in 1940 and years later translated into English by the author as The Wrath of the Ancestors. It was hailed as one of Africa's finest novels. It captivated readers because of its lyrical prose and its treatment of Western intrusion on the culture of amaXhosa. But what captivated my father most was that the novel was about our clan, the Amampondo Mise people. Father Sa would have baptized me, or would not. Father Sa would not have baptized me into the Roman Catholic Church without what he called a Christian name, which had to be a saint's name. But my father, an ardent Pan-Africanist, insisted that he would not give me a white name. So he opted for Kizito, after the youngest of the Ugandan martyrs. Although Kizito had only been beatified at the time and was not yet a fully fledged saint, he had since been canonized. The priest approved. My third name, Katyeni, was my father's way of giving a nod to his ancestors by naming me after one of them. The grounds of the mission station are exactly as I remember them when I played with my friend Bernard on our tricycles, and when I followed my father around on a path between the buildings, a newspaper in my pocket. Even though I could not read, I always carried a newspaper with me, just like my father, or a book, any book from his shelf. It didn't matter that none of its pages was illustrated. The fact that I was walking around with a big book in my hand, just like my father did, was satisfaction enough. It could be Abu Ben Adam and the Angel, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, or a tome by George Eliot, or one of the Bronte sisters that my father taught in his English literature classes, or the William Wordsworth poetry that he made his students recite. During these walks, Father would himself recite Mark Antony's oration, or sometimes Macbeth. I had no idea what the words meant, and he never bothered to explain. But his voice still reverberates in my head, tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. My father was also an ardent gardener, and the staff quarters at St. Teresa did not give him the opportunity to consummate his relationship with the soil. So he rented a house at the nearby village of Kwaqina, and we moved there. He cycled to work every morning, and after school, he worked in his garden, particularly on those days when he was not conducting the school choir. When he was too tired to water the flowers and vegetables, he sat on a chair on the stoop and drew pencil portraits of the twins and me and anyone else who happened to be around. People always marveled at how he was able to bring out a person's likeness exactly as the person was. Later, he bought a number of Jersey cows and employed village women to churn butter in big jars that were normally used for bottling peaches. I remember rows of women, some in red ochre isikaka attire and big Ikea turbans of the Abatembu people, sitting in front of the hatchery and shaking the jars to the rhythm of four-part harmonies. Occasionally, a woman would be carried by the spirit, stand up and flaunt a few oscillations of the waist and shoulder, and then sit down to resume churning the butter. In the hatchery, there were batteries of incubators. Father encouraged villagers to raise chickens for meat. They bought day-old chicks from his hatchery. When my mother got a job as a nursing sister in another village called Darcy's Neck, my parents employed a nanny to look after us. Nontonje was initially a red girl, which meant she wore the traditional red ochre clothes, but she was soon socialized into floral dresses that were mostly hand-downs from my mother. I didn't know of my father's activities besides his teaching and farming. Sometimes he was away for extended periods. We heard adults talking about how he had been banned by the Minister of Justice, C.R. Swart, from attending any gathering in any place within the Union of South Africa. Then we heard that there was a big problem between him and some local villagers, particularly the village chief, Steyn Sinwamadi, who was supported by Mr. Fischler, the primary school teacher. We never got to know the nature of the problem exactly, but it was somehow related to a civil action in which my father was suing Steyn Sinwamadi for calling him a communist. And the native commissioner of Herschel, our district, was in full support of the village chief. Perhaps Fischler was going to give evidence on behalf of Sinwamadi and the native commissioner and tell the court that they were not being libelous, since my father was indeed a communist, as confirmed by his membership of the African National Congress. Anyone who fought against apartheid was regarded as a communist and was likely to be banned under the Suppression of Communism Act, even if he was as anti-communist as my father was. Most likely, Sinwamadi and Fischler were being used by the commissioner to spy on my father. There was so much bad blood between my father and Sinwamadi that he haunted my dreams. He was reputed to be a powerful Iqwele, a medicine man, and I feared that he was going to harm my father with his wizardry. Nontonje, our nanny, who understood these issues better, kept me and the twins abreast of events, particularly on Sinwamari's prowess in the field of magic. She painted a vivid picture of a stick that he used to cast spells, which was also capable of transforming into a snake. His name, which is Sesotho for the one who drinks blood, or even more ominous, the bloodsucker, added to my anxieties about the safety of my family. One night I was woken up by a loud knock on my bedroom window. And there was Sinwamari's stick, peeping between the curtains. "Hello, Kizito," it said. "Ndiye zangapo," which means, "I'm coming over there." Behind it out there, I could see white horses dancing in the dark, flames raging from their hoofs. The next morning, I told Nontonje about the visit, and she confirmed that, indeed, that was clear evidence that you don't mess with a medicine man of Sinwamari's stature. 2 decades later, I wrote a poem titled Dance of the Ghosts, based on the incident. It begins, "I dream, and my dreams are dreams of ghosts. I see them prancing and gamboling in the moonlight. Their eyes glow with impish pride, and their feet dance to the rhythm of no music." As the days for the court case approached, the dream became recurrent until Nelson Mandela came from Johannesburg to rescue me. His presence assured me that Sinwamari's stick would be defeated. He was a lawyer from the firm of Messrs. Mandela and Tambo, and was instructed by my father to handle the case against Sinwamari and the Native Commissioner. I liked him because whenever he visited our house, he never forgot to mention how handsome I was. He was quite handsome himself, with finely combed hair parted on the right in what we called the road. That was my father's style too, a style that I often asked Nontonje to do on my head. Alas, my mother never allowed my hair to grow long enough to make the road noticeable. Mandela was not just my father's lawyer, but he was his friend as well. When Anton Lambede died in 1947, my father, a founding member of the African National Congress Youth League, took over as its president. But the following year, he had to leave Johannesburg because of ill health and went to teach at St. Teresa. He continued with his presidency and periodically made the trip to Johannesburg to catch up with ANC Youth League business. Later, he set up a working committee comprising Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo to manage the activities of the organization in his absence. Even when we still lived at St. Teresa, Nelson Mandela would sometimes drive all the way from Johannesburg to consult with my father. One day, Mandela came to St. Teresa with a briefcase of documents in preparation for some ANC conference where the Youth League was to present its strategy. He was not aware that the special branch corps were following him. When he arrived, My father was in his junior certificate literature class. Sister Eusebia, the principal, called him outside, and he and Mandela conferred for a few minutes before Mandela handed him the briefcase. Mandela drove away. But as soon as my father got back to his classroom, there was another knock. He opened the door, thinking that it was Mandela, who had perhaps forgotten to tell him something. But it was the police, both uniformed and special branch. They pushed him aside and walked into the classroom. They wanted the briefcase, but it had disappeared, and my father did not know where. What briefcase? My father asked. We know that Mandela gave you a briefcase, said an Afrikaner special branch officer. Where is it? My father pretended he did not know what they were talking about. At the same time, he really did not know what had happened to the briefcase. The policeman turned the classroom upside down, but there was no briefcase. They were fuming because they had hoped to arrest my father with incriminating documents, and then, of course, arrest Mandela before he got to Umtata, where he had clients to defend in a criminal matter. Perhaps he didn't leave the briefcase after all, said a black special branch man. They left in a huff. No one said anything about the briefcase for 3 days or so. My father was wary of asking, lest he incriminate himself by admitting ownership of it. One could never be sure whether or not there was a police informer among the students. One day, Sister Eusebia called him to her office. Are you not missing something, Mr. Mda? She asked. Before my father could answer, she gave him the briefcase. There was a sigh of relief. She told him that as soon as the students realized that the police were at the door, the student in front reached for the briefcase and passed it to the student sitting behind her. It was passed from student to student until the one who was sitting at the window threw it out. Sister Eusebia was there to catch it and hide it. Some of those students became political activists. Ezra November and Naftali Sidzamba, for instance, became PAC leaders. Okay, that's where I will end with that segment. I will read another segment then. Well, after this, of course, then we went to Lesotho as exile, and quite a few things happened and so on. And then from Lesotho, I came to America for the first time as a student at Ohio University. So this segment that I'm going to read here is really about my culture shock when I arrived in America for the first time, when I arrived in Athens, Ohio. I don't know if you know Athens, Ohio. Athens, Ohio, which is my town, which is where I live up to this day. Athens, Ohio, September 1981. My first culture shock was that there was no jazz in America. I expected the air to be permeated by the trumpets of Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie, the saxophones of John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Eric Dolphy, Sonny Steed, and Charlie Parker, the double bass of Art Davis and Charles Mingus, the flutes of Roland Keck and Heavy Man, the xylophone of Miles Jackson, the guitars of Barney Castle and Kenny Burrell, the pianos of Thelonious Monk and Oscar Peterson, the drums of Art Blakey and Max Roach, and the demented scuds of Sarah Vaughan, Lorez Alexandria, and Ella Fitzgerald. But no one I met in the college town of Athens had heard of any of these cats. All the radio stations played country music. Not even soul music, not even rhythm and blues, just the bluegrass and other mountain sounds that whined in my ear like an irritating mosquito. Even my new African-American friend, Reggie from Dayton, Ohio, had never heard of these names, except for Ella Fitzgerald, who was getting a lot of airtime on television doing a commercial for Memorex. I couldn't get over the fact that Reggie had never heard of Ella Fitzgerald before the Memorex commercial. The only jazzmen we used to admire growing up in Lesotho and in South Africa, who were known to Reggie, and most of the people in the town were Ray Charles and Quincy Jones, only because they were crossover artists who practiced in more popular genres as well. Jazz or no jazz, the quaint town with red brick buildings dating back to its foundation at the turn of the 19th century, and the red brick paved streets captivated me immediately. Life had its pace here, easygoing and unrushed. A direct contrast to the hustle-bustle of Johannesburg. Even Maseru had more of a rat race atmosphere to it than Athens. This suited me well. I was burnt out from all the fast living. I immersed myself in student life and became a regular at the Graduate, a bar on West Union Street. The first few months were a struggle because I had neither a scholarship nor a job. But fortunately, the head of the School of Theatre, Bob Winters, and the head of the playwriting program, Seabury Queen Jr., did their best to see to it that I got a small stipend from the university and arranged for my accommodation at the Convocation Center, where I shared a room with a Japanese student. Ohio was the first university I attended on a full-time basis. To date, all my education after high school had been by correspondence. I was admitted here on the strength of my published and performed plays rather than my art education with the now defunct Swiss Academy. My mentor, Seabury Queen Jr., was a cantankerous but lovable man with a mustache and a bow tie. He was cynical about everything, but for some reason he liked me, and we spent a lot of time together. He had many questions about South Africa and seemed to be fascinated by the fact that there were white people who were either so foolhardy or so brave as to live in Africa. He invited me for his Thanksgiving dinners, where it would be only the two of us, facing a whole turkey stuffed with cranberries and a huge pumpkin pie that could feed a family of 5. He lived in a log house in the woods just off Richland Avenue, and I got the feeling he was a very lonely man. Maybe he was not lonely at all. Maybe he was just a loner, like me. It was only after his death, years later, that I learned from Joanna Perry, who was my fellow playwriting student under Seabury's tutelage, and now makes films in Hollywood, that our Seabury had demons of his own that were haunting him. He adored you, but he was a troubled soul, Johanna told me. I thought he was just a grumpy old man, I said. I didn't know he was a troubled soul. What was troubling him? It could not have been easy being a gay man in a time when gays were reviled in this country, she said. And Seabury was grumpy for a reason that he once told me, which was the shadow of his father, the writer, who he felt he could not live up to. He had a lot of old feelings that were never resolved in his psyche, I think, as we all do. I didn't know of Seabury's sexual orientation, and I felt very angry at his culture that was, and unfortunately largely still continues, to be intolerant. I knew about his father, Seabury Queen, the famous author of the Weird Tales series, featuring the occult detective Jules de Grandin. But I didn't know that our Seabury had issues about being his son. He never mentioned his father to me. I was glad that Joanna told me this because I now understand Seabury better. Our friendship endured even after I left Ohio University. We continued to correspond over the years, right up to his death. But it was always about work, about my novels and plays. He kept up with what I was doing and read every novel I wrote. Sometimes I would tell him of my play being translated, say, into Catalan and being performed in Barcelona. And he would say something bitchy like, well, you know, every little bit helps. As if it was no big deal to have a play in Spain in a regional language. And then, of course, after a few struggles, I skip a number of paragraphs here. After a few struggles and mishaps and rooming with various people and so on, I wanted to leave and find an apartment of my own, but I couldn't afford it. The stipend from the School of Theatre was too small for such a luxury. I couldn't even afford food sometimes and had to sell my blood for a few dollars to survive. On 2 occasions, my blood was rejected. They didn't tell me why. I had become anemic and suffered from dizziness. Maybe I was harvesting too much plasma in order to buy my favorite subs at Rex Beef Sandwiches, or a few items of groceries and toiletries at a super duper store on Stimson Avenue. It was at this time that I remembered Jane Fonda. When we had dinner at the Lesotho Hilton, she had said to me, next time you are in the United States, do see me. Normally people say such things to be nice, just to make small talk. But I told myself that I didn't give a damn if she meant it or not. I was going to take her up on that. I had kept her postal address and telephone number in Santa Monica, where she lived with her husband, Tom Hayden. So I got in touch with her and told her of my predicament. She told me that, in fact, I had contacted her at the right time because she was planning to make a movie set in South Africa and was looking for the right property. She immediately engaged my services as what she called a script consultant and sent me a check in advance. With her money, I was able to rent myself a nice basement apartment on East Carpenter Street from Professor Gifford Doxey. It was fully furnished with a big kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, and a laundry room with a washer and a dryer. I lived like a king. I was even able to send flowers to Kinelwe occasionally through Interflora. Now I could entertain as well. Apok had long completed his studies and returned to Kenya, but I had a number of friends from Africa. There was Baratang from Botswana, who was doing her PhD in education, Zanele and Simpiwe, both from South Africa, and both doing African studies, Mike Kirubi and Macharia Munene, both from Kenya and doing PhDs in international business and history, respectively. Another friend was Augustine Hata from Rwanda. Hata is the only one who I met later in life on African soil. He had been the head of the Rwandan broadcasting services during the period that led to the genocide. He was able to escape and found refuge in Tanzania, where he continued to live, or he continues to live and teach at the University of Tanzania. He and his wife once visited me at my house in Johannesburg. I remember all these people very fondly because we had such wonderful carefree times together, which were nevertheless very intellectually stimulating. I felt for the first time that I was becoming a real scholar. Here my promiscuity ceased and my excitement at discovering sex so late in life waned. The only vice that remained was drunkenness. In the meantime, the South African establishment got to hear that Jane Fonda was planning a movie set in South Africa and became hysterical. Alden Library at Ohio University subscribed to the Sunday Times published in Johannesburg, and one day I saw the headline, "Though not fond of it, Jane wants South Africa's story." A columnist by the name of Adrian Monteith wrote, "I have news of quite extraordinary gravity this morning. Jane Fonda, the famous aging banshee, wants to write, produce, and direct a film about South Africa. Since her views on the world are only marginally less extreme than those of the crazed red grave woman, I shudder at the possible result." She had been obsessed with the project since her 1981 visit to Lesotho, when she was held at Jan Smuts. There is yet no story for the film, which is still very much in the planning stages, but it is known that she wants to make it in Lesotho. End of quote. I was quoting the newspaper article here. Jan Smuts was the airport in Johannesburg, now known as O.R. Tambo International Airport. I had not known that Jane Fonda had been detained there by the South African authorities when she was in transit to Lesotho. The article went on to express the hope that since Fonda had engaged my services as a consultant, I would help with the authenticity of the script. And this paranoid diatribe was from a supposedly liberal South African English newspaper. You can only imagine what the conservative Afrikaner newspapers were saying. Well, that's where I will end with that segment. My final reading, which will just be 2 paragraphs, come from the very end of the book, the last 3 paragraphs of the book. And then after that, I'll take your comments and your questions. Father haunts me like a song that persistently rings in my head, like a jazz number that wiggles itself in and out of my consciousness, like the deep and dark tone of A.B. Lincoln. I've just read in the paper that she's dead. An era is passing before my eyes. I remember her with Archie Shepp in Golden Lady. But even more significantly, I remember her with Coleman Hawkins in Max Roach's We Insist from the Freedom Now suite. It was music that they created in honor of our freedom struggle in South Africa and the United States. It spoke of the atrocities of the Sharpeville massacre. Overwhelmed as a young revolutionary by Max Roach's drums, Michael Olatunji's congas, and the percussion of Raymond Mantilla and Thomas Duval in Tears for Johannesburg from the same suite, I composed my poem, a sad song. Who will bury us, we who died a painful death of the sounds of the drums of death? We whose screams were swallowed by the winds, it is not an untruth. Our own shall be our own in death and in life, we insist. This is the last stanza. I wailed the poem out like the wind at poetry performances in the exile of Lesotho. Oh, how romantic it was to be a revolutionary those days. Our prophet was Frantz Fanon, and jazz was the hymnal that nourished our souls. Yet there was death too. Real wars where sons and daughters of loving parents shed blood on the roadside. We were certain of victory. We were certain Matundu ya Uhuru, the fruits of liberation, would be enjoyed by all in a land of equal opportunity. Equal opportunity. Father haunts me in such a way that I cannot extricate myself from his ghost. I have become him, for he lives in me. He shunned the limelight and was what he called a backroom boy, a thinker behind the scenes. I'm even worse in that regard. I'm an ultimate outsider on a road to hermitage. Like him, I work with peasants in the villages, and despite myself, I'm satisfied with the little that I have and give the rest away. We differ though, because he was doing it for the people as part of his commitment to the struggle. I'm doing it for myself, for my own happiness. Yet the void widens. Thank you.